All right, so hopefully you all are in the right room. This year is going to be History of the Clean Water Act. So let me do just start with like maybe a little tiny bit about me. So my name is Scott Berry. In my professional life, I'm the Director of Policy and Government Affairs for an organization called the U.S. Water Alliance, which is a national nonprofit working to modernize and transform the water sector through collaboration. And I've been in water and infrastructure policy for pretty much my entire career, which is about 14 years or so now since I graduated. And policy debate also is it really changed my life. It helping me to sort of be a better thinker, a better writer, and really teaching me not only to ask questions about how the world worked, but how to ask those questions and who to ask them to. I debated for 4 years for the University of Mary Washington in Virginia, starting as a novice in college in my first year. And for what it's worth, I guess in my third year, my partner and I qualified at the NDT through our district tournament. And after college, I did some coaching and judging, and Noddle was kind enough to invite me to share my perspectives with you all as sort of a water policy expert, but also as someone that kind of understands debate. So I'm able to kind of wear both hats in that respect. And usually when I give talks like this to audiences all over the country, I usually have to apologize for talking a little faster than normal. But this might be one of the only audiences where I don't have to make that caveat and where it won't be an issue. So let's dive right in, shall we? Let's see here. That's sure. All right. Let's see the slides. All right, perfect. All right, so we're going to start with an old joke about a dead guy. So when I was first cutting my teeth in the policy game, the head Democrat on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee was this guy named Jim Oberstar. So he'd been on the T&I committee for decades, right? And since he was a freshman in 1975. So he rose to be the top Democrat on the committee when, after the Gingrich Revolution kind of swept Republicans into control of the House following the 94 midterms. And then when the Democrats took back control of the House in 2006, he became the committee chairman. And working with him was really interesting. Like, he was an enthusiastic guy, but he was super long-winded and kind of like a boring speaker. And he was also fluent in French from his early work as a missionary in Haiti. So he would kind of frequently slip into French for chunks of his speeches for no reason at all. And the joke used to be that you could tell how long he intended to talk for based on at what point in history he started his remarks. And one time we had him as one of sort of like several congressional speakers for a big event in DC at my last job. And he was the first on, and he was about 25 minutes late arriving, which does happen all the time with members of Congress. They're almost always late. So we had this like packed agenda, and really like every minute was accounted for. But he finally shows up. We get him on stage, and I had two more members who were both Republicans actually. Were both next to me backstage. So Oberstar kind of walks up to the podium. He takes his deep breath, fixes his jacket, and he starts talking. He says, "Now, back in ancient Rome," and there's just these audible groans from all of us backstage. And I tell you this story for two reasons. The first, in the hopes that you don't kind of groan at me when I sort of start this conversation a few centuries before the Clean Water Act itself. And the second reason, which is going to be revealed a little bit later. So now, early human history is sort of inseparably bound up with this history of water. And water infrastructure like wells and latrines are some of the oldest infrastructure on record. And for centuries, everything people wanted to get rid of went into the water. Now these wastes were typically organic, like human waste, animal carcasses, and natural systems broke them down over time. As small villages grew into towns and towns into cities, waterways were starting to become overwhelmed by the amount of disposed waste, and many rivers essentially just became open sewers. As you can see, population growth played a big role in this, and sewer collection systems popularized as cities grew in the 1800s, mostly as a response to public health concerns to help control outbreaks of things like typhoid and cholera. But these were generally not treatment systems. They were more like collection systems. So they collected human and animal waste into pipes or trenches or sewers and sort of discharged them directly into rivers, lakes, and oceans. And then you had the Industrial Revolution in the latter half of the 1800s, which dramatically added to this problem. Chemicals that were starting to be used in industry were added to that mix in rivers, and many of these substances could not be broken down or biodegraded. But like kind of using a dropper in a bucket, the dilution of those pollutants in large amounts of water was thought to be an effective method of disposal. And incidentally, it is the origin of the philosophy, the solution to pollution is dilution, which many of the old guard in kind of water still say today. And it's extremely scary when folks kind of bring that up. So we're at the twilight of the 1800s now. New century is staring at the face. The government starts to take action. You've got the Rivers and Harbors Appropriations Act of 1899, which is commonly called the Rivers and Harbors Act, which is arguably the nation's oldest environmental law because of a section it contained called the Refuse Act. And the law, this Refuse Act, prohibited discharging refuse matter of any kind into the navigable waters of the United States or tributaries thereof without a permit, excavating, filling, or altering the course, condition, or capacity of any port, harbor, channel, or other areas within the act without a permit, or damming navigable streams without a permit. So you've got no dumping and no alteration without express permission from the federal government. Anyone care to guess the two most important words in any of those things? You want to try and toss that in the chat, anybody's guess. Any guesses? Two most important words in any of the what's all there. Roger's got it, navigable. That's one of the big ones. All right, I'll kill the suspense. The other one is permit, and that's going to become a little bit more obvious as we kind of talk about a little bit later. But both of these terms become incredibly important in later fights about the extent of the federal government's power to regulate waters. And it's important to note that the Rivers and Harbors Act was not aimed at preventing water pollution, but rather at preventing the dumping of materials that might impede navigation. And its reach was just limited to these navigable waters. In the 5 decades following the Rivers and Harbors Act, waterways continued to be used as a convenient way to dispose of waste, right? So like waste disposal was seen as a legitimate use of these waters. And as a result, substantially more pollutants are being discharged into the nation's waters at a greater rate than the waters could absorb. So fast forward now for a few decades. You've got 2 world wars, you've got the post-World War II industrial and urban growth, you've got bouts of recession. Add to that the widespread philosophy that water regulation is a state issue. You've got a 1945 report that came out that showed that the roughly 3,500 communities in the United States pumped 2.5 billion tons of raw sewage into streams, lakes, and coastal waters every single day. 2.5 billion tons of raw sewage every day. Years of failed congressional attempts at a solution, though, ultimately led to a watered-down compromise bill. Congress tried to tackle this over and over again, and they kept getting, not being able to reach agreement. So they came up with this sort of compromise bill, which was the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948. Unfortunately, as I maybe alluded to, it was not well designed, and it achieved very little, and was nearly completely rewritten by the Clean Water Act several years later. This act, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act 1948, gave individual states most of the responsibility for controlling water pollution, especially through interstate agreements. So in addition to preserving states' control over waterways, the act limited federal authority for the most part to just preparing pollution abatement plans and like providing support to the states so that they can solve the problem themselves. And enforcement was only authorized when water pollution originating in one state endangered the health or welfare in another state. So only then could the federal government act, but only after this super cumbersome process and with the permission of the state where the pollution originated. So effectively, polluters had veto authority over enforcement. And this provision gave the states virtually unlimited power to override a federal action to prevent water pollution. Surprising no one, I bet. In the 2 decades after the act was passed, there were essentially no enforcement actions filed under the act. Because of the federal government's sort of inability to require any direct reduction in discharges, so pollution really continued to increase, and the quality of the nation's waters did not significantly improve after the implementation of this act. And still, it was the first law in the United States to focus exclusively on addressing the problem of water pollution. It was the first real federal acknowledgement that water pollution was a problem, not just because of commerce and impeding navigable waters, but because of health. I want to quote from the report language for just a second. And so for folks that aren't familiar, like when a bill passes out of committee, it gets sort of a side text called the report, which walks through the committee's thinking on the bill kind of section by section, especially for lawmakers that weren't part of the bill writing or debate to get them up to speed. This is most important when a bill comes out of the conference committee after passing the House and Senate. So this is a report, a quote from the report language. Pollution of our water resources by domestic and industrial wastes has become an increasingly serious problem due to the rapid growth of our cities and industries. Polluted waters menace the public health through contamination of water and food supplies, destroy fish and game life, and rob us of other benefits of our natural resources. At the time, this is like in 1948, this was radically ahead of where modern environmental movements would be for maybe 20 years. And another positive legacy of this act, even though it didn't really actually do much, is that it demonstrated both popular and political support for pollution control efforts. It also established the kind of basic framework for water pollution control, with the states playing a big role. Congress ended up passing several more bills to try and kind of fix the problems in this act, but ultimately ended up just sort of completely rewriting the bill in 1972, which we'll get to in just a second. So during the latter half of the 1950s and well into the 1960s, water pollution control programs were really shaped by laws that amended that 1948 statute. Kind of just talked about that. They dealt largely with federal assistance to municipalities and with kind of like federal enforcement programs to try and give them a little bit more teeth, but ultimately without a whole lot of success there. One fun story, though, is in a 1956 kind of cruise down the Mississippi River by a Minnesota Democrat by the name of John Blatnick, who was the chairman of the House Public Works Committee's Rivers and Harbors Subcommittee at the time. He was on the river to kind of assess its locks, dams, and levees, right? This is a thing that members of Congress do all the time, is they take really nice trips up and down the Mississippi River to try and figure out like what the state of the infrastructure is and see it for themselves. But he was really struck by the river's filth. And Blatnick's former chief of staff once said that the Mississippi was just a cesspool. And he came back to Washington determined to do something about this. He being his boss, John Blatnick. Incidentally, that former staffer went on to win Blatnick's seat after he retired, his seat up in Minnesota, and this was 1975. His name was Jim Oberstar. He was the guy that we talked about in the very beginning. So Blatnick, anyway, crafted the Federal Pollution Control Act of 1956 to provide research on the causes and treatment of pollution, sort of funding for wastewater treatment plants and a conference mechanism for states along major water bodies to sort of agree on some of those pollution limits and cleanups to try and help bolsters the failing provisions of the 48 Act. So this bill was passed and signed into law by President Eisenhower. But as the Public Health Service kind of began to dig into these wastewater treatment problems, which was one of the things that, remember I said that the 56 bill wanted to research the causes and treatments of pollution, as they kind of actually started to do that research and dig into wastewater treatment problems, they found that they were way more serious than anybody thought. So Blatnick drafted a new bill to strengthen federal enforcement powers and really step up the construction of wastewater treatment facilities and boost research. The legislation passed the House and the Senate, but ultimately Eisenhower vetoed it. In his veto message, Eisenhower said that water pollution is a uniquely local blight. And the now familiar refrain that you'll hear over and over again if you're doing any research on this topic is that primary responsibility for solving the problem lies not with the federal government, but rather must be assumed and exercised, as it has been, by state and local governments. But when President Kennedy took office just about a year or so later, expanding the water pollution program, or the water pollution control program, I guess I should say, was one of his very first goals. So he said that our nation has been blessed with a bountiful supply of water, but it is not a blessing we can regard with complacency. He said that in a special message to Congress on natural resources. This was just like a month after his inauguration. He addressed Congress like this. And he also said that to meet all needs, domestic, agricultural, industrial, recreational, we shall have to use and reuse the same water, maintaining quality as well as quantity. And in many areas of the country, we need new sources of supply, but in all areas, we must protect the supplies we have. So dramatic shift in the president's views on what the proper role for the federal government is. And so Congress then delivered a new version of Blatnick's old bill to Kennedy's desk that July, and this time it was signed into law. So during this period, the federal role and federal jurisdiction were gradually extended to include navigable intrastate as well as interstate waters. So that's waters that are within states and not just that go between states. So, and water quality standards became a new feature of the law in 1965, the Water Quality Act. So those things required states to set standards for interstate waters that would be used to determine actual kind of pollution levels and control requirements. We'll get to that in just a little bit more later when we talk about the Clean Water Act. But by the late 1960s, there was a widespread perception that existing enforcement procedures were too time-consuming and that the water quality standards approach was sort of flawed because of the difficulties in linking a particular discharger to violations of stream quality standards. So it's really hard to sort of say, like, you are the cause of this pollution. And additionally, there was some real mounting frustration over really the slow pace of pollution cleanup efforts and sort of the suspicion that technologies were being developed, but not really applied to problems, right? And so these perception and frustrations, along with some real increased public interest in environmental protection, sort of set the stage for what came next. So I'm gonna pause there just a second and take a quick look at the chat. Okay, don't see anything. All right, let's get back to it then. So that brings us to the end of the 1960s, when another story sort of caught fire in the national imagination. So in June of 1969, the Cuyahoga River caught fire. The fire took place in Cleveland, which is a few miles north of the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. So the heavy industry really dominates this section of the river, if you're not familiar. So railroad bridges kind of crisscross the river, and they sort of trapped debris in the river, kind of causing it to pile up. Sort of acting just sort of like a screen, and then oil on the water sort of added to its flammability. So this oil was like coming up from the downstream or the upstream industrial plants, and so you had oil slicks that were sort of running into these railroad bridges that sort of trapped this trash. So you had all this oil slick trash, so a train most likely provided the spark that ignited the debris, sort of like going over the railroad bridge. You know, some sparks from the train wheels ignited the debris, this oil-soaked debris that was on the bottom of the bridge. The fire ended up lasting for maybe about a half an hour and resulted in some minor damage to the railroad bridge. The 1969 fire did not surprise people at all, at least people locally. The river had burned at least 10 times over the previous century. And the first newspaper coverage kind of focused on the minor damage, not the fact that the river had caught fire, because that was a fairly common occurrence. And almost immediately, though, the narrative began to change, and some national outlets started to pick up this story, oddly enough. The following month's Time magazine, when magazines were still a thing, proved to be kind of another big factor in this. Many Americans ended up buying this issue of the magazine, not because of the fire at all, but because Senator Ted Kennedy, in a big neck brace, was the cover photo after he had driven his car off a bridge at Chappaquiddick and Martha's Vineyard, resulting in the death of a young woman. This was a huge scandal. Tons of people were interested in reading more about it. But this issue also contained a rather small article, kind of buried in the magazine, on the fire with this picture. And so the article described the Cuyahoga as the river that oozes rather than flows, and that which a person does not drown but decays. And interestingly enough, this photo actually isn't even of the photo, or isn't even a photo of the 1969 fire. It's actually from an earlier fire on the Cuyahoga River. But this photo just sort of caught the nation's imagination. And the 1969 fire is often portrayed as a direct cause of the environmental movement. And the first Earth Day in 1970, just a year later, or even the Clean Water Act in 1972, are also kind of many sources sort of traced back to this. Like most things, it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? Like lots of things kind of contributed to the environmental movement, to Earth Day, to Clean Water Act. But by 1969, sort of some changes were also underway. Nationally, the Water Pollution Control Act had gone through its fourth set of amendments. Remember, the last slide was just the 60s were mostly about changing clean water laws. And then the fifth version of it was also being crafted in Congress at this time. Locally, Cleveland voters here had already passed a $100 million bond issue in 1968 for the specific purpose of sewer construction and water treatment plant upgrades to help protect Lake Erie. And while the Cuyahoga River was at the time one of the most contaminated rivers in the United States, make no mistake about that, it also wasn't alone in that department, right? Like, and it wasn't the only river to catch fire either. The Rogue River in Detroit had set ablaze a little bit earlier in 1969. The Buffalo River caught fire in 1968, all for the sort of same reason, this sort of combination of toxic flammable sludge and trash that just sort of catches fire. At that time, the fire, however, was just one more reminder about water pollution that kind of piled onto public sentiments about the need for change. But once it's in the public eye, though, it really started to stay. And the fire really makes frequent appearances in sort of textbooks about the environmental movement. So you may have seen this picture before. So whatever the motivation, people demanded action. So among those answering the call was this guy, Senator Edmund Muskie. He's former governor of Maine, was elected to the Senate in 1958. He gained some national importance when the environmental movement was sort of growing in the 1960s as sort of a key champion on the Hill. He's, was one of those kind of key early movements. And when the presidential election of 1968 rolled around, which, and it as an aside, like that is an absolutely bonkers election. If you have any interest in political history at all, I urge you to take a look at it. It is really, really interesting. But anyway, in the 1968 presidential election, Senator Muskie here ended up being the Democratic vice presidential nominee to help balance out the more moderate Hubert Humphrey. So to try and combat the narrative of sort of the social upheaval of the Johnson administration, which is the one right before this, which Humphrey was a part of, right? He was Johnson's vice president, so to combat that sort of social upheaval narrative and the sort of violent anti-war protests that marred the convention, Humphrey and Muskie leaned into a more infrastructure and more environmental policy proposals as part of their kind of platform, because it ended up being relatively like very popular. But they were running against Eisenhower's VP. Eisenhower was one of the most popular presidents at this time. And this guy ran on a platform of just rejecting protests. 1968 ended up having a lot of them. There was the one after Martin Luther King was assassinated, after Robert Kennedy was assassinated, the aforementioned riots at the Democratic Convention. But so he runs on this platform of rejecting protests and sort of return to the social order. He was a guy named Richard Nixon. And there's a reason why you know who Richard Nixon is, but not who Hubert H. Humphrey is. So Humphrey lost that election, and Muskie went back to the Senate. Nixon became president. Nixon never met a popular idea he couldn't steal, and he really likes the popularity of some of these environmental policy reforms. So he starts signing things like the National Environmental Policy Act and the Clean Air Act, and ends up being the guy who actually creates the EPA and the President's Council on Environmental Quality via executive order. So a lot of stuff happens at this point. But back to Muskie here. So after his loss in 1968, he sort of rededicates himself to reform. And he, is assigned to what many saw as just like this super inconsequential committee in the Senate. He saw an opening for tackling environmental causes and ended up turning the Public Works Committee into a voice for clean air and clean water in the United States. And the list of environmental legislation that he personally crafted or was involved in is very long. And he actually ended up calling the 1970 Clean Air Act his greatest achievement. He was also the principal author of the Clean Air Act. But he was the principal author of what would become known as the Clean Water Act in 1972 as well. So he would actually later run for president in the 1972 election, but ended up through, if you're interested, is also another really interesting story, but was sabotaged with a bunch of fake scandals that were created by forged letters. Some folks, actually, like conspiracy theorists, have this sort of really interesting theory about how Richard Nixon was behind some of this stuff. But anyway, he served as a senator until 1980, after he lost the primary in 72. Then was tapped to be President Carter's Secretary of State right about the time the Iran hostage crisis happened. So that didn't go super well at all. So he just ended up retiring after that. So he had this incredible environmental legacy, but ultimately his political career by many is considered a failure because of his failed election attempts and his failure as Secretary of State. Huge bummer, but anyway, he retired after that. So we've got the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972, which later became known as the Clean Water Act. That was a bill introduced in the Senate in 1971, October 71, by Senator Muskie. After some strong support in committee, it was passed by the Senate 86-0. And the House version was shepherded through a few months later in March of 72 by Blatnick and Oberstar, who was Blatnick's chief of staff now at the Public Works Committee. After the House and Senate sort of hammered out their differences and the final version passed the House and Senate, that was October 4th, 1972. Passed the House 366-11, and it passed the Senate 74-0. But of all the environmental policies that had crossed Richard Nixon's desk in his first term, and now mere weeks away from Election Day 1972, he decides that this one costs too much, which is about, the Clean Water Act at the time was about $24 billion in cost. Which is about 176 billion in 2020 dollars, which is about, for comparison purposes, about a quarter of the Pentagon's 2020 budget. So Nixon vetoes the bill on October 17th. in his message says, legislation which would continue our efforts to raise water quality, but which would do so through extreme and needless overspending does not serve the public interest. He declared the bill budget wrecking. And according to some news reports at the time, Nixon actually waited until about 40 minutes before the bill would have come law without his signature to issue his veto. So presidents have 10 days to veto a bill, excluding Sundays, otherwise it becomes law. So just 2 hours after the president sends up his disapproval, his veto, the Senate voted 52-12 to override the veto, with actually 17 of those votes coming from Republicans. And the next day, the House voted 247 to 23 to override, which was a margin of more than 10-1, with also almost 100 of those 247 also coming from Republicans. So massive override of that veto, incredibly popular bill. Also, one more interesting side note, Nixon actually didn't give up on this because he's Richard Nixon. He used his presidential powers to sort of do what's called impounding, to impound half of the funds appropriated by Congress. So impoundment is when Congress says, you should spend $10 on this, and the president says, I only want to spend $5 on this, so that's what I'm going to spend, and I'm just going to hang on to the rest. So Nixon also used this on a whole bunch of other federal programs he didn't like, including like highway money and a bunch of other things. So this sparked a huge constitutional feud with Congress over who controlled the purse strings. And the dispute ultimately ended up going to the Supreme Court, which ended up ruling that the president has no authority to withhold funds provided by Congress in the Clean Water Act of 1972, and that the president cannot frustrate the will of Congress by killing a program through impoundment. So now the Clean Water Act is law. So now comes the sort of so what part of our talk. The Clean Water Act is the primary federal law regulating water pollution in the United States. So the opening paragraph sets out its purpose, which is to maintain chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And it does this through the elimination of discharges of pollutants to surface waters. So there's a couple of key things I want to cover. I want to cover Section 401, which is water quality certifications, 402, which is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Systems, or the NPDES program, 404, the Dredge and Fill program, which is about wetlands mostly, and then the construction grants program. There are about 135 benchmarks in this legislation. There are things that are like eliminating all water pollution by 1985, or have all waters fishable and swimmable by 1983. Not a single one of those 135 benchmarks were met in the time frame envisioned. But it was ambitious. Excuse me. It was ambitious, and eventually we got to something like 65% of the nation's waters cleaned up as of today. And I want to say a little bit about the philosophy that informs the law as well, this sort of concept of cooperative federalism, right? It's a political concept where the different levels of government sort of work together rather than separately but equal. Think of sort of like a marble cake where the chocolate is sort of spread in all parts of the cake versus the 1800s philosophy that held that state authority and federal authority were starkly different layers. It led to the belief that states are the equal of the federal government, which didn't turn out so hot as it turns out. You see the Civil War. So anyway, what cooperative federalism means in the case of the Clean Water Act is that EPA is authorized to delegate authority to the states for the administration of certain parts of the Clean Water Act. In this case, it's 402 and 404 in cooperation with EPA. One more word of warning, though, is that Republicans have sort of weaponized this phrase, this cooperative federalism concept, in the last 10 years as sort of their solution to what they saw as federal overreach. And it's in many policy circles now sort of code for deregulation in most cases. So the next couple of parts are going to be me sort of like walking you through some of the key parts of the Clean Water Act that govern a big chunk of water resources protection today. And I'm trying not to be too technical, but as sort of a lifelong policy guy, I kind of like live in the details and the nuts and bolts. And I'm going to make sure we pause after each section to make sure folks aren't too lost. But maybe I'll take 1 second there just to take a look at the chat and see if there are any questions. Let's see here. Roger, at this point in history, were there waterways that exclusively for dumping waste or with others preserved for getting clean water for drinking, bathing? So I assume kind of like we were from 10 minutes ago, that would have been kind of like the 1960s, 1970s. So there weren't really waterways that exclusively were for dumping waste, but it was still considered a sort of like legitimate use up through the 1960s when they sort of decided that now is the time to sort of stop doing that, and we really need to create better standards. But there were some kind of bodies of water that were exclusively reserved for drinking water, which is sort of I know it's hard to wrap your head around, but like it is also a completely separate kind of set of laws. So the laws and regulations governing drinking water and water used for like drinking, bathing are totally separate from what we're talking about now, which is kind of the waters that end up in the environment versus what is taken from the environment for like human used purposes. Cool. All right. So we are at section 401. So back in the 1960s, I briefly mentioned this sort of concept of water quality standards. It's the sort of idea that states have to establish their own standards for water quality. In this new iteration that comes out of the Clean Water Act in Section 401, water quality standards must achieve the purpose and goals of the Clean Water Act rather than just being like whatever the states want to do. That means the states have to set standards of how they're going to meet the Clean Water Act. They have to be reviewed every 3 years, and they must be approved by the EPA. It's a big step forward in kind of like states' responsibilities for water quality. So water quality standards kind of consist of statements that describe quality requirements. So they usually contain numeric limits, like so be like no more than X amount of bacteria or Y amount of salt in our state's waters. But they can also be qualitative, right? Like we want this river to be fishable because not all requirements for water quality protection can be numerically defined. But sort of here's the real key and why I kind of pull this section out as one of the important ones to know. Section 401 of the Clean Water Act requires that any applicant for a federal license or permit that deals with water also obtain a certification from the state that what they are doing also complies with the state's water quality standards. So if you want the feds permission, you also have to get the state's permission. You got to ask both mom and dad on this stuff. And this applies to all sorts of permits that the feds issue, not just Clean Water Act permits. It's like for the Coast Guard, for the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulation Commission, and the Army Corps. So the scope of this certification power, which is effectively a state veto on any activity that requires a federal permit, was recently narrowed by the Trump EPA. Some states have been using this certification authority to block things like required federal permits that would be built in their states, like pipelines, for example, because they don't meet their water quality standards or because they could have the potential for wrecking their water quality standards or because of like a climate impact. So Trump's EPA said that this certification has to be limited only to the scope of issues covered in the Clean Water Act. And many have argued that this was a significant narrowing of both state authority and a restriction on water resources protection. I think it's worth looking into potentially as affirmative ground as sort of like this section 401 water quality certification. All right, so section 402 of the Clean Water Act requires that all municipal, industrial, and commercial facilities, as well as any construction sites on an acre of land or more that are discharging wastewater or stormwater directly from a point source, so like a pipe or a ditch or channel, into surface water of the United States, like a lake, river, or ocean, must obtain permission to do so. This is called a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit, or NPDES permit is sort of a shorthand the industry uses. So this is your core water permit system, the system that governs the restriction of most pollution into our nation's waters. There's big state involvement here in this program, almost entirely administered by the states. You've got 46 states that run their own 402 programs instead of the national EPA, and states that are without delegated authority are Idaho, Massachusetts, New Mexico, and New Hampshire. So NPDES permits may be tailored to an individual discharger or cover a general category of discharges, right? So for example, a power plant with a cooling tower that intakes water from a river, uses it to cool the facility, and then discharges it back into the river will probably need an individualized permit to account not only for the chemicals that might be coming out of that power plant, but also the temperature at which the water returns to the environment is. But a construction site for an office building, for example, is generally a fairly standard hole in the ground. So there is a construction general permit for stormwater runoff that most construction sites can use. NPDES permits last for 5 years and must be updated every time they are renewed. So all of these sorts of industrial facilities, water treatment facilities, they all have to obtain a permit to discharge into environmental waters. And most of the time when you think about sort of like a facility or a site or something, think of your classic image of a polluter with a sort of pipe of green stuff pouring out of the river. The part of the Clean Water Act governing that are these Section 402 permits, these NPDES permits. So I'm going to pause and make sure, because I said I was going to check the chat and Q&A after each of these sections, and I forgot to do it after 401. But Let me just do a quick double check. Okay, looks like we're good. Sorry, I'll try and keep checking after these. So the next one I want to talk about is section 404. So this section is less about your traditional sort of pipe that empties into the stream, and it covers the rest of the entities out there. So nearly all economic activity that is involved in building something or growing something is touched by this section 404 permit system. Turns out that's almost all of the economy. So section 404 requires a permit for the discharge of dredged or fill materials into jurisdictional waters and wetlands. So basically, you can't put earth into jurisdictional waters and wetlands without a permit. This is why the debate over what a jurisdictional water is matters so much to so many. And as folks kind of pointed out, why the word navigable was super important too, in terms of like some of the early Rivers and Harbors Act kind of definitions of what jurisdictional waters are. There are other reasons, but really the 404 program is definitely the biggest reason why that kind of debate over the extent of the Clean Water Act matters so much, is because depending on which waters are covered, it shows you which kinds of projects, whether they're building or growing something, farms or construction sites or manufacturing, whatever, which of those are subject to this program and which ones aren't. The debate over the extent of the Clean Water Act and which waters it covers is largely about which waters the Section 404 permit covers. This is called the Waters of the U.S. debate, and I could do a whole nother one of these conversations just on that one topic. But for today, let's just say that's kind of like an ongoing controversy. And I'll mention it one more time a little bit later. So unlike the 402 permits, this permit program is managed both by the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA. And also, unlike the 402 program, most states have not assumed the federal authority for the 404 program. Part of administering the 404 program is making kind of case-by-case determinations about specifically which waters are jurisdictional and which ones aren't. So if you think that we have kind of mapped and determined all waters in the United States and determined which ones are federal and which ones aren't under the Clean Water Act, you'd be sorely mistaken. There are way too many. So that's what the Corps of Engineers does now. And it's part of why they co-manage this program, is they go out and do those sort of case-by-case determinations about which waters are and are not federal waters. This is a massively expensive process. And to be able to field the amount of expert staff needed to do this and to pay for that is part of the reason why states have not taken on the authority to do this. To date, only 3 states, Michigan, New Jersey, and Florida, have assumed 404 programs, and Florida actually only just, for a long time, it was only Michigan and New Jersey, and Florida just got it about a year or so ago. About 8 other states, Alaska, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Minnesota, North Dakota, Oregon, and Virginia, have also explored or pursued wetland permitting programs under Section 404, like assumption of that authority. But they haven't gotten super far yet. And Arizona actually did come close. They started the assumption, they actually began the assumption process in 2018, but ultimately decided, based on local pressure within the state, decided to abandon it in 2020. So last thing you need to know here is that, like 402 permits, 404 permits sort of have 2 types, sort of nationwide and individual. We talked sort of about how, like, in 402 permits, they're like individualized ones are sort of tailored to the site, and then there were general permits for different categories of sites. So they call that's sort of broken out in the 404 program as nationwide and individual. Depending on the type of project and the level of impact, you could get a nationwide permit, which is designed to cover kind of a general category of discharges, like say like a river restoration project with bank stabilization to prevent erosion. That's a change in earth that goes into the jurisdictional water. So you'd need a permit for that, but there's kind of a general permit that covers that. Or you would need an individual permit with project-specific requirements for something like a new highway system that crosses a whole bunch of different streams, because it's a linear project. And so you would need to make sure that all of those things are accounted for on an individual basis. So other than permit requirements, there's a couple other kind of key differences between the nationwide and the general nationwide and individual permits, namely the amount of time and money it takes to achieve them. So like a nationwide permit, which is sort of like your generalized version, costs about 30 grand to obtain, which is a lot, but in the general scope of some of these projects isn't a ton, but it takes about 3 to 6 months to, on average, to obtain that permit. But individual permits are much worse. They take at least a year or 2, some of which are much longer. I've seen highway projects that took 9 or 12 years to get an individual permit. And they typically cost millions and millions and millions of dollars to get. So there's a whole vested interest if you are a builder or a grower in making sure that if you have to get a permit, you want to make sure that you can qualify for these sort of like generalized nationwide permits rather than the expensive and time consuming to obtain individual permits. All right, let me double check the chat here. Okay, we are good. Okay. So one of the big advancements of the Clean Water Act is that it requires every wastewater treatment plant to meet secondary treatment standards. So we're going to do like the quick and dirty lesson of how a wastewater treatment plant works. So this is super simplified, and each plant kind of does things a little differently. But stage one of treatment is called primary treatment. So wastewater kind of comes in, and your big debris gets screened out. So this is like branches, trash, and stuff. The water then moves on to a settling system so that heavier stuff like sand and grit can sort of settle to the bottom, and the lighter stuff like oils and fats, they float to the top. All that stuff is called sludge, and it gets removed and processed separately into sludge digesters. Until the Clean Water Act, tens of millions of people were served by systems that either didn't have primary treatment at all and just sort of discharged raw wastewater into rivers and streams, or they only had primary treatment. So the water just sort of came in, it filtered out some of the big trash and sort of let the sand settle out of it, and then the rest of the chemicals and stuff just flowed right into the river. Secondary treatment is where you take water that comes out of that settling tank and feed it into various tanks with tons of microbes and aeration and a bunch of stuff. So the microbes kind of eat all the bad stuff out of the water and they sort of clean it. And once it's done with that, it goes through an active disinfection process, most popular of which are like chlorine or like UV light. So the Clean Water Act required every treatment plant to be at least secondary treatment. So that was a huge step forward. It's like everybody has to be disinfecting and cleaning water rather than just settling stuff out of it. Congress recognized that this was an incredibly expensive thing to require local governments to do. Secondary treatment hadn't been around for super long at this point, just maybe a couple of decades. So technology was still fairly expensive and the construction was fairly intense. And so requiring local governments to do this would be like they're super expensive systems to design, to build, to operate and maintain. So in order to keep the Clean Water Act from becoming this giant unfunded mandate on local governments, like you have to do these things, but we're not going to pay for them, they created what was called the Construction Grants Program. They said, we're going to make you upgrade, we're going to force you to upgrade, but we're going to pay for all of it, or a big chunk of it. And they did. Federal grants accounted for between 55% and 75% of most projects undertaken under this. So the federal government ended up dumping billions of dollars of grant money into local governments to build and upgrade their facilities, their treatment facilities. So this program also required the states to establish priority lists of the projects that were in their state so that the biggest impact projects for meeting the state water quality standards, remember the states have to say like, we want these things, this is how we're going to meet the Clean Water Act. And then so now they have to do a list of like, okay, here are the projects that are in our state that will help us meet that. And we're going to rank them by priority so that the projects that have the biggest impact for meeting those water quality standards got done first. Revolutionary. As a side note also, this is the origin of one of the big main rivalries between kind of like wastewater people in the industry and drinking water people in the industry, right? The Clean Water Act recognized that compliance was expensive and added a bunch of money in the form of grants to end up to help local governments comply with these new requirements. The Safe Drinking Water Act, which was passed a few years after the Clean Water Act in 1974, did not have any grant money or any capital funding of any sort attached to it for state drinking water facilities. So wastewater enjoyed years of federal subsidization while drinking water did not. And let me tell you, they never forgot that. Even to this day, it is now 2021, almost 50 years later, and the drinking water guys still say, well, the wastewater guys enjoyed years of federal subsidization, and so we're already behind the curve. And you wouldn't believe the amount of weird old rivalries in the water sector about that. This would be one of those things where I would love to talk about it when I'm not being recorded. So now that we understand kind of the big parts of the Clean Water Act, let me get back to the history and storytelling for a second. Actually, let me double check the chat and make sure there aren't any other questions on some of that thing. So let's see, Roger, what was the impact of secondary treatment on lead pipe corrosion? Good question. So secondary treatment kind of comes after lead pipe corrosion. So like the way a water system works is you've got drinking water, which flows through pipes, and those would be the ones that are lead pipes, through those pipes to people's houses, and then from those houses it becomes wastewater, and that goes through the primary and secondary treatment system. Lead didn't have a ton of impact on that. There is sort of an impact that the treatment chemicals, when you're looking at lead pipes, one of the ways the Safe Drinking Water Act says that you can treat lead in pipes is to add phosphates to your sort of drinking water chemistry. Harmless to people, but ends up in the wastewater because it's in the drinking water. And then you've got to create a wastewater treatment system that pulls those phosphates out. So that's one of those ways that sort of the Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act are sort of in conflict is too strong a word, but are not congruous. And part of one of the impacts of developing them is totally separate regulatory and legislative structures. And so in some cases, some industry sources have said that like the treatment chemicals are worse impacts than others, and that would be one of those cases. But it's also, you have to kind of weigh the impact on your wastewater system versus making sure that lead doesn't leach out of your pipes and poison your people. So it's 6 to 1. I wouldn't even say it's 6 to 1, half a dozen of the other, because human life is a lot more important than wastewater treatment systems. But wastewater treatment systems do cost a lot of money, and so that is that. But good point. So yes, the impacts on drinking water do have impacts on wastewater, and vice versa, because if you've got somebody putting wastewater out of their system that maybe has like just a little, it's like just under the legal limit of, I don't know, say like nitrates, but then downstream, that river that you're discharging your wastewater into is the drinking water source of the next town downstream. Your wastewater actually does impact their drinking water. You see that all over the country. Texas especially is notorious for this, where like some big cities are upstream of the same rivers of other big cities. And so what is in their wastewater dramatically impacts the drinking water of the downstream city. All right, let us return to history. So the 1970s sort of roll along. Lots more environmental policy is getting passed, like some enhancements and some clarifying amendments to the Clean Water Act in 1977. You've got the Safe Drinking Water Act in 74. You've got the Endangered Species Act. You've got RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is governs like solid waste and hazardous waste. So you've got now the election of 1980 rolls around, ushers in the quote unquote the Reagan Revolution or whatever. So the focus ends up being on cutting spending, beating the Soviets, trimming government down, right? So it turns out to be a pretty popular philosophy, and Reagan is reelected in 1984 in a historic landslide. But in the 86 midterms, Democrats regained control of the Senate and built on their majority in the House. So the Congress that began in January of 1987, after these 86 midterms, was the historic 100th Congress of the United States. And a bunch of Congress folks wanted to start it off with a big victory, right? So they got a relatively popular piece of environmental legislation that didn't pass in the last Congress, mostly because they knew Reagan would veto it, that they could champion now that they had control of both chambers. And that was the other reason why it didn't pass, is because they didn't have control of the Senate. So enter the Water Quality Act of 1987, which is most often referred to as the 87 Amendments to the Clean Water Act, but for the purposes of this, we'll keep calling it Water Quality Act. So the Water Quality Act was the first bill of the 100th Congress that was sent to Reagan's desk. He promptly vetoed it, following the footsteps of Richard Nixon. But Congress also overrode the veto, and the law was enacted in February of 87, so literally just like a week or two later. So what did this bill do? So let me tackle a few of the smaller but important changes. So first, it made explicit the authority of the EPA and the Corps of Engineers to fine people for failures to obtain permits and for violations of their permit. That wasn't 100% clear in the Clean Water Act or in the 77 amendments. And so now they made it explicit that the government can fine you for not meeting your obligations under the law. It also created the administrative process for reviewing and challenging these penalties, which continues to be an issue today. And it has actually just another case went up to the Supreme Court in 2012 about that kind of administrative process. It also created a program to help what are called combined sewer overflows. So some cities, let me toss a little picture up here for you. So some cities have the same network of pipes to transport both stormwater and raw sewage. These are primarily eastern cities, older cities. If you've ever walked around in like New York or in DC and you kind of like smelled sewage in the middle of the street, this is why. It's because there actually is raw sewage in the storm drains under you. So normally everything flows fine into a treatment plant. But when you have a really heavy rainfall event, the sewer system can't handle all that extra water all at once. so it ends up venting out straight to waters. This is called the combined sewer overflow. And dealing with this problem is one of the single most expensive undertakings in all of water infrastructure. Usually you have to build like a giant underground storage tunnel underneath the existing sewer to use as a storage, as sort of like overflow for when the system overflows. This costs billions of dollars. Like the DC Water, which is a utility here in DC, which is working on this, is working on a something like a multi-billion-dollar combined sewer overflow pipe system underneath its existing facility. The other option, instead of like these billion-dollar giant underground pipes, is you have to separate your sewer system so that you have a different network of pipes that covers your stormwater that can wash right out, and a different network of pipes that covers your wastewater, your sewage. That also costs billions of dollars. So this bill created a grant program to help pay for projects to fix that unique and costly CSO problem. So let me go back here. So another important change in the 87 amendments were, let me hang on. Let me double check the chat and make sure. Okay, yeah, combined sewer overflows can be tough to get, so I just want to make sure. There we go. All right. So another important change in the 87 amendments is that programs that, like, prior to the 87 amendments, programs like the Clean Water Act were primarily directed at kind of point source pollution. So like, but little attention was paid to non-point source pollution. And it kind of, so that would be like, as it travels across land towards rivers and streams, like you've got rainfall and snowmelt, which picks up pollutants as it kind of flows, including things like sediments, conventional wastes like nutrients or animal waste, and that over time they build up in this water as it flows across land and goes into like your river system. So instead of being like a pipe that discharges into the river, it's sort of like these diffuse smaller sources that aggregate and collectively become more. Those are unregulated by the Clean Water Act entirely. So the 87 amendments sort of authorized some measures to try and address this kind of pollution, but mostly it was directing states to develop and implement non-point source sort of pollution management programs. And this actually remains one of the thorniest issues in water regulation today, the cyber concept of non-point source pollution. And I'll get to that a little bit later when I kind of talk about the what's next sort of stuff, but I'm also going to talk about it in the State of Water Policy lecture that I have later today. So you can tune in for that one if you want. But the biggest change in the 87 amendments was one that was actually embraced by Republicans. It was a big part of why they actually chose to go with Democrats and override Reagan's veto on this. So remember, we talked about the construction grants program, right? Like that was this big system of grants to help local governments afford water treatment systems. Well, Republicans from Reagan to president, or rather from Reagan to present, meaning now, they decided they don't really like grants. They're handouts of free government money that really don't sit well with them and they're really bad for the budget, right? So they want to kill the construction grants program. They don't want this anymore. I think, we don't need this anymore. But Republicans also realize that they represent lots of small rural places that really can't afford to comply with the Clean Water Act without them. So instead of the grants, they replaced the program with a new system of state-based loans. The federal government kicks in a little money up front, and in theory, after a while, the program becomes self-sufficient and comes off the federal balance sheet entirely. So it shrinks the federal government, you've got more power given to the states, and it reduces spending, all while still serving small and rural communities. It's a win-win-win for Republicans. Thus was born what is called the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, which is popularly known as the SRF. Yeah, that's it. So the SRF works like this. Every state has a bucket of funds. Every year, the feds kick in a certain amount of money for this seed capital, and the states also kick in some. That's your state matching funds and your federal capitalization grants. The currently required match is 80-20 federal state, so like 80% of that money comes from the feds, 70 or 20% comes from the states. So you've got this bucket of funds. They use that money to issue loans to utilities and other municipal entities to complete infrastructure projects. That's what's labeled disbursements on this chart. They are very favorable terms with these loans, like super low interest rates. They're typically even lower than a municipal bond market, and they have really long payback periods, like 20 or 30 years. Some states also leverage their SRF dollars, which is sort of what you see on bond sales here. It's kind of too complicated to get into some of the details right now. The short version of it, it's like selling insurance on other bonds for a profit. It's a way that some states have found to make their money into more money. So as utilities pay this money back, plus interest, even if it's a low amount of interest, it all goes back into that original bucket. So that original bucket, the SRF, slowly grows over time, and that money gets turned, in turn, gets loaned out to new projects to start the cycle again, hence the name revolving fund. All 50 states and Puerto Rico now have functioning SRF programs. I think DC has something similar as well. But the legacy of federal grants is hard to shake. And the transition was actually a bigger challenge for some communities, especially small towns, than the kind of Republicans and Congress in general really originally thought. They've kind of, even though these are relatively low interest loans, they have difficulty repaying them anyway. One of the major criticisms of the SRF now is that it is primarily a tool for large and medium-sized cities, leaving some of the smaller folks that relied on the grants out of luck. And even larger cities are sometimes finding more favorable terms on the municipal bond market, so they're not using it either. Another issue is kind of the ongoing nature of federal support. So remember why the SRF was so popular as a program in the first place was it was supposed to shift the burden of paying for the Clean Water Act back onto the states and get the grants program off of the federal books. Well, the theory was that after a few years of seed money, the feds could just walk away, so that like federal capitalization grants, arrow would go away, and so it would just be the states putting money in. Turns out that hasn't been the case, right? The ballooning need for water infrastructure and like the funding for water infrastructure has really outstripped the SRF's ability to keep up. That gap in what we have been spending and what we need to be spending keeps widening. This is partly due to some new pollutants that need to be cleaned out of water that we didn't think about. Years and years of deferred maintenance kind of taking its toll. Population increases, especially in some regions. Populations are growing faster than we ever thought. And all those things that necessitate water infrastructure capacity expansion before like the life of existing infrastructure expires. And speaking of the life cycle of infrastructure, this is a chart I made back in 2015, of the amount of federal dollars appropriated for water infrastructure under the Clean Water Act programs. It's adjusted for inflation, which is why you don't see this chart anywhere. Green is the construction grants program. Orange is the Clean Water SRF, and blue is the Drinking Water SRF. So they created a parallel program on this in the 90s for drinking water. But green and orange are sort of what I want to talk about right here. I want you to think about two things looking at this chart. First, consider the massive decrease in the overall trend of federal investment in our nation's water infrastructure. This is like a massive decrease in the buying power of the federal dollars that are put towards water infrastructure. Second, I want you to look at the big influx of dollars from the construction grants program. Think about the massive amount of water infrastructure was put in place in the 70s and 80s. Most of that was designed and engineered to last about 40 or 50 years. Guess how long it's been? So we've got this big infrastructure bill that's about to be coming due soon from the stuff that was originally put in place that we haven't even replaced yet, is about to be needing to replace, if not already. All right, so I want to close here by talking about a few of the big kind of remaining issues around the Clean Water Act. First and foremost, waters of the U.S. and jurisdiction. So this was the ongoing fight over the true extent of the Clean Water Act I kind of talked about earlier. So this has resulted in several high-profile cases in the Supreme Court through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s over this topic specifically. And both the Obama and the Trump EPAs put a ton of effort into figuring this out. And both efforts, meaning like they both put out big regulations on this. And then the Trump folks kind of pulled back the Obama regulations and put their own ones in, but both of those are still working their way through the courts. And make no mistake, the Supreme Court will be having to weigh in on this topic again soon, and sooner rather than later. And I know for a fact that the Biden EPA is also weighing how it wants to wade into this fight right now, since they're almost about 100 days in now. Second issue is that one I talked about a little bit ago, non-point source pollution. That's pollution running off of things like farm fields and suburban streets that is largely unregulated by the Clean Water Act. It's a big blind spot in the law's protection. And sort of as an aside, like there are some estimates that non-point sources represent about 50% of the nation's remaining water pollution problems. And like I said, I'm going to cover this a little bit more detail in my State of Water Policy talk later today. Third is that the SRF authorization has expired. And remember how the original intent was to sort of stop federal spending on the SRFs after a while? That was 1994 was the last time the SRF was sort of legislated on. The statutory authorization for grants to capitalize the state loan programs expired in 1994. And Congress is sort of weird, right? Like, understatement of the century, but their process is that you have one set of committees to devise programs and set up policies to run those programs, and another set of committees is the one that actually spends the money on those programs. And so technically, when a program is no longer authorized by those first set of committees, the rules say that the spenders can't spend money on those programs. But the spenders, because they like being powerful, break those rules all the time. In this case, Congress has continued to provide annual appropriations to the state revolving loan fund programs, even though it's an unauthorized program. And multiple attempts to reauthorize the Clean Water SRF over the years have happened. The closest we came was probably 2010, but actually I think we're getting very close this year. And 2 years ago, we actually ended up reauthorizing the Drinking Water SRF for a couple of years. And so we're hoping this year to reauthorize both the Clean Water SRF and the Drinking Water SRF in the next couple of weeks. Actually, we've got a bill going to the floor in the Senate hopefully next week. Anyway, fourth is this sort of broader category around technology. So we know that there are toxic pollutants that cannot be seen or tasted, but they are dangerous to human health. But our ability to detect these things is moving a lot faster than our ability to effectively and economically treat them. We're talking like detection in the parts per trillion. That's like detecting a single drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And the way our technology is, like, we can get stuff cleaner and cleaner, but each successive level of cleanliness is harder and harder to achieve and costs more and more to get those smaller and smaller parts out of water. It's like it's big diminishing return. So that's kind of like this weird paradox in water technology right now. Another obvious issue are all the challenges posed by a changing climate that the Clean Water Act never envisioned, like our need to secure treatment infrastructure from sea level rise or flooding. The thing about wastewater treatment plants is that you usually want them at the lowest point in your city so that you can use gravity to help your water flow downhill in your kind of wastewater and sewer pipes. And you also want it at the water's edge so that you can return clean water that's been cleaned in those facilities right back into the river or other water source. So you've got low points on shorelines that are the first places to flood and the places in greatest danger of sea level rise. The final issue is one of policy paralysis, what I call kind of like mutually assured destruction. Like, nobody wants to reopen the Clean Water Act because both Republicans and industry, along with Democrats and environmentalists, both equally fear that what comes out of that process of trying to improve the Clean Water Act will be worse for them. Why risk a potentially worse outcome for you if you can live with the status quo? So the incentive structure is backwards. But like the last sort of thought I want to leave you with is that the Clean Water Act is like the legacy of the Clean Water Act is still a tremendously positive one. Like, I've spent a whole bunch of time talking about kind of like some of the issues and some of these future problems, but it's an undeniable fact that waters now are cleaner than they were 50 years ago. You have significantly more rivers and streams and lakes that are fishable and swimmable. We've accomplished a ton. We've got a lot more that needs to be done, but there's a huge legacy of improvement in the nation's waters over the last 50 years. And we're actually coming up next year on the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And so, like, looking back over the last 50 years, the level of improvement is hard to understate. But looking ahead to the next 50 years, it's like we've got so much more left to do and so many more kind of holes to plug. So hopefully that has kind of like been an interesting part. And I know this has sort of been a lot, and we've covered a lot and a lot of history and a lot of stories. So and hopefully you caught most of that, but let's sort of like, I want to open it up for some more questions, some discussion, and like see if there are other ways that we can kind of talk through some of this stuff.